Over the last 4 years, as we know, this conclave has come to be recognized as a very important forum for the discussion and dissemination of significant ideas of both national and international relevance. This year's theme of perception and reality is, I believe, an apt theme for looking at emerging India. The good news is that the gap between perception about India and the reality seems to be surely narrowing. A Google search, though an admittedly unscientific test, reveals that 10 times more references linking India and China than India and Tiger, and 100 times more than India and Maharaja than even 3 years ago. And I have no doubt that this conclave's deliberations will further help dispel many an illusion about the Indian economy. The question posed by the topic of this session, can India become a global manufacturing hub, entails a gaze into the future. I think it was Yogi Berra, the legendary baseball coach, who said, "Prediction is hard, especially about the future." However, my task today is made much simpler since the trends and the data before us suggest a vote in the affirmative for India as a manufacturing hub. But before talking specifically about the India story, let me focus briefly on some of the important global trends in manufacturing. Manufacturing hubs emerge due to a process of agglomeration. Because of agglomeration, a disproportionate surge of manufacturing is attracted to locations with a lower wage cost or higher market access, or both. Thus, when textiles manufacturing shifted from the US Northeast to the US South, then to Japan, Korea, and now finally to China and India, it fits a predictable pattern. The same is true when the auto industry shifted from Detroit to Mexico across the border, and Brazil, and then again to Southeast Asia. This shift of manufacturing from west to east is evident in industry after industry. For instance, nearly 2/3 of the world fiber production comes from Asia today, the same as the share of North America and Europe in 1980. Reflecting the shift in production basis, nearly 1/4 of the world fuel demand now originates in non-Japan Asia, compared to just 1/10 in the early 80s. To take a more recent example, China, Thailand, and India have contributed to 36% of the increase in world vehicle production between 2001 and 2004. China itself now accounts for 1/4 of the global steel and aluminum demand, nearly 1/3 of the coal demand, and 40% of the world's cement consumption. At a macro level, during the past 30 years, the weight of global GDP has been progressively shifting away from North America and Europe towards the ASEAN region. The share of OECD Europe has declined by 5%, and that of the US and Japan by 1% each. The average GDP growth of China and Korea over the past 23 years, on the other hand, has been 9.5% and 6.7% respectively. Even Taiwan, Malaysia, and Vietnam have had impressive 6+% growth rates. India's growth story is well known to all of us. The point I wish to make is that incremental GDP and incomes are rising much faster in Asia, which means incremental growth in demands for all kinds of manufactured goods will arise substantially in this region. India's location, amongst its other strengths, makes it ideally poised, along with China, to take advantage of this growth in regional demand. Despite concerns that the importance of manufacturing is declining at the global level, the global share of manufacturing in GDP is still close to 25%. Again, this share is much higher for the fast-growing developing economies of Asia, which bodes well for us, although on the whole, globally, much of the MVA, or the manufacturing value added, still comes from the developed world. The share of global MVA has, however, declined from 85% to 75% for developed nations, whilst for developing nations it has gone up correspondingly from 15 to 25%. In India itself, the share of MVA or manufacturing value added is about 17% of our GDP, much lower than our peers in East Asia, which indicates a very substantial headroom for growth. So a closer look at this global picture shows that manufacturing is not at all declining at the global level. There will be large opportunities for those who can fit into the shifts that manufacturing is undergoing, and the large opportunities are especially exciting for our part of the world. Let me now present the case for the emergence of manufacturing hubs in India. I ask you to look at three determinants. First is the phenomenon of inflection, that is non-linear growth signifying takeoff for the Indian economy. Second is a set of some emerging trends that I believe are going to favor India. And third is the set of imperatives in the context of India's own developmental needs, which will propel us towards boosting our manufacturing sector. So first, let us talk about the phenomenon of inflection. With its size and rate of growth, India today has a critical mass in many sectors. For many commodities, India has become either the largest or amongst the largest producers in the world. This includes two-wheelers, cement, steel, generic drugs, laminated tubes, polyester fiber. 90% of the world's diamonds pass through India in their value-added chain from uncut stones to polished gems. On a more micro level, there are many global scale achievements. To mention only a few, the world's largest motorcycle company, Hero Honda, and we have Mr. Munjal here, and the maker of CD-ROMs, Mosebea, are based in India. One of our own companies has the world's largest single location copper smelter and is located in India. Even in the new industrial and scientific field of satellite launching services, an Indian firm is counted amongst the top 6 in the world. 12 Deming Prize winners, regarded as being equivalent to the Nobel Prize for Manufacturing, are from India. The short message of all these achievements is that India can legitimately aspire to become a global hub. It's not a far-fetched target. Rather, it's an ambition based on a proven track record. There is now also sufficient evidence to suggest that the trajectory of India's growth will be on a distinctly higher plane in the decades to come. There was a trend break from the past sometime during the 1980s, which has caused the trend growth rate to be closer to 6% rather than 3.5% in the first 3 decades after independence. This trend of 6% now spans almost 25 years, a period comprising 7 parliaments, 10 prime ministers, and 12 finance ministers, clearly pointing to some growth resilience. Per capita incomes are also growing much faster, owing to deceleration in population growth, and all of this will have dramatic and profound implications for the Indian people and for Indian business, and therefore for the manufacturing sector as well. According to some calculations, assuming an average annual growth rate in India's GDP of 5% over the next few decades, its GDP will double roughly every 14 years. Today's GDP, adjusted for purchasing power parity of $2.95 trillion, will therefore become $24 trillion by the year 2047. American GDP, which is currently $12 trillion, would, at an assumed average annual growth rate of about 2%, have nearly doubled to $24 trillion by 2047, the same as India. Thus, in just over 1 generation, India's GDP could well surpass America's GDP to become the world's second largest economy after China, whose GDP then, according to these calculations, would be $32 trillion. However, linear projections such as these sometimes miss out on the characteristics of an economy that is at the takeoff stage, which is where perhaps India is today. After per capita GDP reaches a certain threshold, higher purchasing power kicks in and growth tends to accelerate. An example of such a remarkable transformation is South Korea, which moved from being a less developed country to an OECD member within a span of about 3 decades. The potential for India to develop as a manufacturing hub ties in closely with this phenomenon of inflection. As has been the experience of other countries, The break in the trend line leads to accelerated domestic growth, increase in disposable incomes, and sharp increases in domestic demand. The booming domestic market builds the drive up to a critical mass of manufacturing that a global thrust requires and calls for. Yet another factor that will reinforce this dynamic is demographics. Demographic trends are clearly in India's favor. Populations and economies like Japan and Europe have already begun to age. On the other hand, it is projected that India in 2050 will have the largest number of young people below 25 in the world, around 550 million, and the largest number of people in the productive age group of 20 to 60 years, 800 million. Global trends are such that large investable pools of capital in countries with aging populations will have to be invested in high growth regions with a large need for capital like India. Incidentally, labor shortages in the developed countries will continue to drive the flow of labor intensive services from countries like India. The confluence of these factors reaching a takeoff point, favorable demographics, and complementarity between countries in labor and capital availability and requirement contribute to this inflection phenomenon. What substantiates this view is that many of India's world-scale achievements are of recent vintage, and the ramping up has been rather steep, reinforcing the inflection belief. For example, starting from zero, within a few years, we now export about $4 billion of refined crude, mostly as petroleum and diesel. We have gone from zero to almost $1 billion of production and export of copper. The speed of the telecom spread in India, as we know, has been breathtaking, a fact that has made even some policymakers admit that they underestimated the market potential. The growth in automobiles and auto ancillaries has also been exponential. These examples reinforce the belief that the inflection phenomenon is bound to take Indian manufacturing onto a higher plane in the coming years. And it is therefore time to stop thinking in linear and incremental terms and dream really big. Let me now shift the focus briefly on two important emerging trends that give India an edge in becoming a manufacturing hub and that spell advantage India. The first trend is the increasing openness of the Indian economy. I use the term as understood by economists, that is, the increasing ratio of traded goods and services to GDP, which for India now is close to 28%. Our current openness is higher than that of the US, for whom it is 23.1%. In this increasingly open environment, we have seen a lot of firms flourishing by using a combination of cost-cutting and nimble innovation, as well as aggressive marketing. Microeconomic data shows that for the past few years, for a large cross-section sample of firms, the rate of growth of export income is faster than the rate of growth in total sales or even total profits. And the second mega trend, of course, is that of outsourcing. What started off as a trend applicable only to IT and IT-enabled services is rapidly embracing auto components, even autos, engineering design, pharma research, clinical trials, and also a variety of services. This will further enable the move to building global-scale industrial activity in India. There seems to be nothing that cannot be outsourced from India. They used to say that some services simply cannot be exported, like, say, cheap haircuts. But in a lighter vein, I think that the day is not far when Indian barbers wearing cyber gloves, sitting in cyber cafes in Mumbai, will be giving their American brethren low-cost haircuts, call it low-tech telesurgery. All these trends bode well for us to aggressively scale up manufacturing in India to serve both domestic and overseas markets. I now add another driver for the manufacturing hub story. This factor is related to the imperatives of India's own developmental needs. What are the imperatives for a manufacturing thrust for India from an economic point of view? The imperative comes from many angles. The first is our development strategy. A high and sustained growth rate of 8% is the only and the surest way to raise a large proportion of people out of poverty. And this high rate cannot be sustained by relying solely on agricultural or services growth. Due to inherent natural constraints on agriculture, the best growth rate that we can hope for would be around 3 to 4%. The services sector cannot wholly grow at very high rates, since almost half of it is in the form of provision of government services. Hence, the manufacturing sector has to be a critical locomotive, and it needs to grow at a close to 10 to 12%, so the economy as a whole maintains a growth of 8%. The second imperative, of course, is demography for the foreseeable future. As we know, India's labor force will grow faster than its population as more youths and more women come into the labor force. And this expansion in the labor force cannot be absorbed by the agricultural sector alone, given the chronically low productivity of this sector. Today, 1/5 of our national output, that is agriculture, is produced by 2/3 of our labor, which is clearly unsustainable. Manufacturing has the potential to make a sizable dent in unemployment and also in the process improve productivity. Industrial wages and productivity are often higher by a factor of 5. So in order to turn the demographic opportunity into a demographic dividend, we have to create jobs in manufacturing. It really is a Hobson's choice. The third imperative comes from resource considerations. We have minerals, metals, fuels that we have been generously endowed with by providence. We have a large landmass, and our population density, notwithstanding a very high population, is only half as much as, say, the Netherlands. While we have to be careful about not depleting our environmental capital, our economy and our ecology can both support substantially higher levels of industrial activity. And fourth is the imperative of attaining cost leadership. India, as we know, is amongst the lowest cost producer for many industrial products. Our overall cost leadership is driven by the advantages in labor costs, and this will sustain well into the future given a pragmatic policy climate. We also have special human capital strengths in engineering and science, as we know, and this highly skilled labor costs much less than its counterpart in Europe or the US. So if I have persuaded you that India's growth inflection, its own development imperatives, mean that we seriously look at building global scale in manufacturing, let me hasten to add that this growth story comes with some important caveats. Let me focus on what I believe are the three most critical ones. As I said earlier, hubs emerge due to an advantage of labor cost and resource availability. But what can seriously hinder or facilitate this process is the policy climate. So first, what about our policy climate needs to change to make it more investment friendly? Economic policy making, again as we know, is an evolving process, often experimental or innovative. Sometimes policymakers can make mistakes, but course corrections are possible. India's telecom policy is a good example of how a relatively quick mid-course correction of shifting from a fixed license fee to a revenue sharing regime gave a huge boost to the industry, to investment in the sector, and the economy as a whole. By contrast, electricity liberalization, which began earlier than telecom, has been unable to change course and therefore has been unable to attract large investments. Singapore, I believe, is an outstanding example of nimble shifts in policy that recognized economic realities and bolstered growth. So the ability of policymakers to create a big impact is linked with how fast policies can be adapted in sync with ground realities. Also, as things stand today, a significant amount of our policy making is centered around the budget, which for many can be a make or break event. Our annual budget, as we know, is always preceded by nail-biting suspense. However, in few other countries is the budget such a watershed event. For instance, in the Southeast Asian countries where we operate, the budget is essentially a statement of government accounts. The key policies affecting business and industry are articulated for a period of at least 5 years and are not subject to annual budgetary shocks as in India. The result is that businesses are able to operate under conditions which are stable and more predictable. Hence, if we are to plan and think global, then we definitely need to have a stable long-term policy framework that enables businesses to commit large resources with much greater certainty. Second, infrastructure remains the most critical bottleneck. Let me mention just two areas, ports and power. A detailed survey by the World Bank has found that manufacturers in India face nearly 17 significant power outages every month versus only one per month in Malaysia and 4 in China. 9% of our total output is lost due to power breakdowns compared to 2.6% in Malaysia and only 2% in China. Moreover, our combined real cost of power is 74% higher than Malaysia's and 40% higher than China's. Our port infrastructure also remains very inadequate. While building global scale means that goods need to be exported all over the world, our goods cannot be pushed through the bottleneck of our ports. India's 12 major ports handle only about 30 million TEU traffic, while the need is probably close to 100. The traffic capacity of Singapore or Hong Kong is at least 4 times the largest Indian port. The turnaround time for ships docking at Indian ports is worse by a factor of 10 compared to our East Asian peers. Many large exporters have had to build and operate their own jetties to overcome these constraints, and this is a handicap that is tough to neutralize in a cost-competitive world. And third, let me emphasize the last mile issue of implementation. Plans and policies are only as good as the speed at which they are executed. We need to put a much higher premium on speed of decision making as well as implementation to ensure that projects get off the ground and reach fruition at the earliest. This is even more true for FDI. More often than not, investments remain thwarted for lack of speed in getting approvals. In conclusion, I would say that it is the responsibility of both corporates and policymakers to ensure that India does not miss the bus. India's roadmap to becoming a manufacturing hub will have to be based on the building blocks of a global vision, a passionate mindset about manufacturing, focus on value-enhancing innovation, and a facilitating business climate. Whilst it may be difficult and even impractical in an operational sense to conceive of making a whole country competitive across all sectors, we can definitely work out and implement a strategic blueprint to make industrial sectors or clusters competitive. What eventually will clinch the issue in India's favor, I believe, will be the never say die attitude of Indian entrepreneurs. On more than one occasion, we have proved the cynics wrong by bouncing back even stronger in spite of the severity of the constraints. India's economic history has always been marked by homegrown entrepreneurship, which goes back more than 100 years, and the way Indian businesses respond, even when in dire straits, is nothing short of astonishing. India and Indians would be right and justified in terms of dreaming big to become a global manufacturing powerhouse, and it is this indomitable spirit of the Indian entrepreneur that will succeed in taking India to the world. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Arun Puri and the staff of India Today. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Anand Raman, one of the senior editors of the Harvard Business Review, without whom anything I said here would be less reliable. Anand is responsible for anything intelligent that I say today, and I am responsible for anything foolish. I come to you as the editor of the Harvard Business Review. Our mission is to improve the practice of management and its impact in a changing world. And in this sense, though I will have things to say about macroeconomics and public policy, it's my belief that what really matters is what happens at the company level, to you and to me, to the men and women with whom we work in the cities and villages where we live and work. There's an American saying that all politics is local. And in that sense, I believe that all economics is micro. It comes down to work, and that means it comes down to business. I also come to you humbly, having been in India. This is my first visit for only a week. During this time, I've learned an enormous amount, visiting companies, feeling the vibrancy and vitality of this great nation, talking to academics, government officials, and business leaders. Still, all of you in this room are obviously far more expert than I am. In that sense, too, I come to you eagerly, because the reason I am here in the first place is our realization at Harvard Business Review and Harvard Business School Publishing that India can and should be a much more important audience for us than it is now. Our owner, Harvard Business School, is, as many of you know, opening a research center in Mumbai. In other words, we're here for precisely the same reason that you are here, because we smell enormous opportunity and sense that India has emerged in the world's economy in a major and sustainable way. The question before us is the shape of that opportunity. The question here is, can India become a manufacturing hub? But that's not the only question. We must first ask Stephen Roche's question. Should India become a manufacturing hub? Is it in your national interest? And assuming that it is, then what is the shape? What kind of manufacturing hub? And third, what steps should India take and Indian companies take to accomplish that? Let's take that first question. Should India become a manufacturing hub? Famously, of course, India missed the first industrial revolution. You can hear two explanations for this, depending on whether you want to blame Britain or not. In the blame Britain version, India had all the ingredients for a textile-led industrial takeoff. It had the looms and other technologies. It had the designs. It had the cotton. It had the skilled labor. It had the access to market, but was denied these things by perfidious Albion. There is truth to that. After all, I come to you from the United States, where we had to fight a war and were lucky enough to win it in order to overcome some of the same restrictions from Great Britain. So in that version, London is to blame. But there is another version. In this other version, India had all the ingredients for an industrial revolution except one: the economic necessity to develop one. Indian labor was so cheap that there was no evident need to pay for expensive capital equipment. Why substitute capital for labor when labor costs next to nothing? An attractive feature of this second explanation, by the way, is that it applies not just to textiles in India, but also to agriculture in China. After all, it's worth remembering that the Industrial Revolution involved food as well as clothing. The revolution in agricultural productivity was perhaps more important in France than it was in Britain, which is why we who speak English hear less about it. And it's mostly accepted that in China, modernization in agriculture was resisted precisely because labor was cheap. The Chinese believed that it was more important to keep people employed in agriculture, even inefficiently, than to modernize the sector and risk the social unrest that would have resulted. Indeed, in both France and Britain, industrialization was a great cause of social upheaval. One historian has remarked that the Industrial Revolution was paid for with the blood of 2 generations of Englishmen. Arguably, it was also created at the expense of 10 generations of Indians. I bring this up, however, because the equation I just described still holds. All of business comes down to one equation, the productivity equation: outputs divided by inputs. The goal is to maximize the value of outputs and minimize the cost of inputs. The question is the composition of those inputs: labor, capital, raw material, distribution, and other costs. Companies in developing economies, such as India, still have the opportunity to substitute cheap labor for capital, the same as India and China did 2 centuries ago. The opportunity is real, but it is also a temptation to save jobs rather than to increase productivity and create jobs, a temptation to avoid investments in modernization, a temptation by governments and CEOs to use cheap labor to buy time, to sidestep the hard choices that might trigger the dislocations often associated with progress. Enough about 200 years ago. What about now? And as India and Indian companies examine the opportunity before them, should manufacturing be a centerpiece of that strategy? If India missed the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, why should it struggle to catch the tail end of it? The case is not obvious. After all, the advanced parts of Indian and Chinese economies are mirror images of one another. About half of China's GDP is in manufacturing, about 25% in services. For India, it's the reverse. That more resembles what the world's most developed economies, those of the US, Japan, and Europe, along with examples like Singapore, have. That they're primarily, as you know, service economies. The classical model of economic development says that you have to go from agriculture through industry and then on to services. But is that a rule of economics, or is it an accident of history? Must ontogeny recapitulate phylogeny? Is perhaps India on the path that will actually take it to greater prosperity in the long run? As we've already heard, from a demographic point of view, India and China have diametrically opposite futures. China's population, while enormous, is stabilizing and aging. China now does not have enough real jobs, that is, jobs with a high enough productivity that they can defend their existence in a truly free market. But in a few years, that will not be the case. China, though still developing, will have the population profile of a developed nation. India, by contrast, has a younger, growing population. Over the long run, India benefits from having a high ratio of workers to retirees, but India will also need many more jobs than China. And is manufacturing the way to provide them? The economics of manufacturing have always been an economics of substituting capital for labor. They are an economics of economies of scale, and it's hard to imagine that changing. The power of capital productivity is so awesome that even today, a super efficient manufacturer like Dell can manufacture competitively in the United States, even though its labor costs in the US are many, many, many times greater than they are anywhere else. At the same time, the economics of high-end services are different. They are not an economy of scale in the same sort of mass production way that they are in manufacturing. I was talking to Sam Palmisano of IBM about this last autumn, and talking about how scale in high-end services reflects not the leveraging of capital, but the leveraging of knowledge. You don't pay an accountant or a lawyer or a consultant by the number of words he or she produces in an hour. You pay by the quality of the words he or she produces. It's not clear, third, that India has or can get a competitive advantage in certain kinds of manufacturing. Though Indian labor is inexpensive, cheaper even than China's, the goal is not to be the world's #1 source of cheap labor. That's a battle whose winner is a loser. And as you look at growing specialization in certain kinds of manufacture in China, you realize that these agglomerations, these hubs of which Kumar spoke, have started to come together in certain parts of the Chinese economy, certainly in the production of clothing, where the Chinese are now producing something in the neighborhood of one set. They're producing more than one set of socks for every person on the planet, 9 billion pairs of socks a year. Professor Gu of Donghua University in Shanghai says that clusters are starting to form in textile manufacturing in China. They're becoming more and more specialized. It's a little like Italy, he says, where you have the city of Como making silk fabric, of Vicenza for fine wool, and Veneto for knitting. This is very advanced stuff. And on the other hand, India clearly appears to be competitively advantaged in certain areas of service. English and the general cultural affinity between India and the developed world help it. The superior management knowledge in India, about which I'll talk in a few minutes, help India in services particularly. Better corporate structures and transparency, a superior financial sector, help India in services particularly. And just as in China we are seeing certain kinds of clusters form, we are also seeing India form clusters in specialized areas of services. You all, of course, know about India's now controlling 31% of the world's IT services businesses. We're now seeing increasing specialization within this. India's medical service industry is one-third the size of that of the United States plus the United Kingdom. It is starting to attract subspecialty businesses around it in medical equipment software, in medical R&D. This week, you may have seen the announcement that Northwest Airlines is inaugurating a flight from Bangalore to Minneapolis, which is a medical and medical equipment hub in the United States. The point is that India's services strength is starting to show up not just as a handful of strong companies, but as a whole cluster, as strong industries themselves, a real sign of competitive advantage. And finally, making the point about services, this is a time when services are globally restructuring, an historic opportunity. Just as 20 years ago, manufacturing started to restructure and globalize, so services are starting to restructure and globalize. Enormous productivity improvements are going to be created from that. Last June in the Harvard Business Review, Uday Karmarkar of the University of Southern California wrote about the coming restructuring of services. This coming June's issue will contain an article by Tom Davenport of Babson College about the same thing. I commend them to you. There's tremendous opportunity there. I am not, however, arguing Stephen Roach's case that India should content itself with services. On the contrary, I am arguing that this kind of analysis suggests exactly the kind of manufacturing hub India can, should, and indeed must become. And I'm also arguing that India has to focus on its development from its own point of view and release itself from the obsession of comparison with China. India is responsible for India's development. India should take charge of India's destiny and no one else's. I believe, therefore, that India has an opportunity to develop a world-class manufacturing sector and that it has no choice. It must. You might call that imperative the French problem because it has to do with agricultural productivity. Some 270 million Indians are in your country's agricultural workforce. If I've got my numbers right, that's about 3/4 of the total. That percentage will and it must decline. Improvements in agricultural productivity are inevitable. As long as Mr. Mahindra is selling tractors, it's going to happen. If the U.S. right now needs only 2% of its workforce to produce not only enough to feed the nation, but to export an enormous amount. Even if India settles at 5 times that, 10%, that means 230 million workers coming off the farm. Where are they going to go? There is simply no way to absorb that many workers without taking advantage of manufacturing. This is, furthermore, the least well-educated sector of your workforce. And manufacturing provides the opportunity for semi-skilled workers and for skilled but not as knowledgeable workers to get real value-added employment. It is a necessity. The point, however, is that Indian manufacturing must be driven at the corporate level. It must be driven by companies seeking strategic advantage. What's right for these corporations is what is right for India, not an industrial policy dictated by Delhi. Why? First of all, because as India's economy opens up, it becomes extremely important for Indian companies to use capital efficiently. When an economy is regulated, it's perfectly possible to succeed and flourish if you are in multiplicity of businesses operating only with modicum efficiency, because the most important factor in your business life is your relationship with the government. That's why in highly regulated economies you see companies that are in many lines of business, because that way they touch many government ministries. As India deregulates and as the world economy globalizes, the most important relationship that Indian companies will have is with their customers and not with government ministries. It's therefore fundamentally important that Indian manufacturing growth be driven by the development of strong companies. Where is that going to happen? I see 3 significant areas of opportunity for Indian manufacturing. I'm going to talk only briefly about the first, the low-end opportunity. My friend C.K. Prahalad has written eloquently in the Harvard Business Review about the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. Clearly, the elimination of global barriers to textiles reopens the door that was closed to India 2 centuries ago. But while I agree with C.K.'s argument, I suggest to you that this is mostly a transitional phase. There is a real danger of creating an economy dependent on cheap labor, a danger in creating an economy dependent on keeping your citizens underpaid by world standards. Indeed, I see India has greater opportunities both at the middle and top of the manufacturing pyramid. In the middle, India's domestic demand and domestic market is an enormous source of opportunity. You know about the coming middle-class growth in India. I won't bore you with it, but point out also that you have domestic opportunities. You also have opportunities in Southeast Asia and in China, either by export or foreign direct investment. I would also like to argue in the middle of the market that you have less to fear from global brands than you might think. An article in the Harvard Business Review by Don Holt and John Quelch points out that global brands really compete mostly with each other. They don't compete with local brands. And ironically, the very infrastructure problems that amount to a problem for Indian exports amount to a non-tariff barrier for global imports. I don't suggest you keep those barriers up. In the long run, they hurt you. But they create a tremendous opportunity for the development of local Indian brands. If I heard one thing this week, it's that Indians are particularly price sensitive and also highly skilled. The combination of high-quality consumer goods at a low price aimed at the Indian bourgeoisie, then exportable to a world where brand premiums are less valuable than they ever were, is a very significant opportunity indeed. And third, I see a major opportunity at the top of the market. This is, as you know, a country of engineers, a country that produces 100,000 new engineers every year. This is a global economy that craves engineering skills. The opportunities for India in high-end engineering are enormous. Embedded software for manufacturing system, high-end machine tools, CNC machining, where Japan's relative weakness in software has started to slow them down. Medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, remote diagnostics might as well use Indian doctors using Indian software in Indian-built equipment, even if it carries the Siemens or General Electric name on the side of the machine. The opportunities from pervasive and ubiquitous computing, software installed in automobiles, trucks, avionics, software in appliances, software in everything. The opportunity for India in high-end manufacturing, in high-end engineering manufacturing, and in manufacturing that exploits India's software industry is, I put to you, an enormous opportunity. There is some theory around this. I will give it to you briefly. It is important to develop manufacturing not just in accordance with core competence, but in accordance with real strategic advantage. Core competence is important, but it is not enough. Core competence is not strategy. Strategy, as Michael Porter tells us, consists in defining those clusters of activities that you and your company are positioned to do uniquely well. Those things that you can do not just in one particular activity, one core competence, but all the activities arrayed around them that you can do better, faster, cheaper, more effectively than other competitors because of your strategy. They are the creation, they are the embodiment of your strategy. Strategy is not just competence, but the set of activities arrayed around competence. From the point of view of this topic, the real issue is clusters of industries, service and manufacturing, built around activities that advantageously support IT services. I've mentioned a few: high-end engineering, automotive, and other appliances. Kumar gave you a better list than I can give you. But take, for example, the automotive sector, where India is the world's biggest maker of radiator caps. The chance is to hold on to that and to move up the value-added scale to electronics and other components of automobiles. Second point of theory behind this vision of where Indian manufacturing can develop a hub is the importance of management as an asset to corporations and to an economy. Some 19 members of the Harvard Business School faculty are from India. It's the largest minority group on the HBS faculty. There's a reason for that. This country is uniquely gifted among developing economies with significant management talent. I put it to you that that is a comparative advantage that you would be foolish not to take advantage of. India has strong companies, whereas China may have strong industries. India has a civil service tradition that sure has created a remarkably bureaucratic government, but also has created a marvelous class of people who are good middle managers, who know what middle management is all about. India has a class of entrepreneurs, unlike China, which systematically destroyed entrepreneurship during the Cultural Revolution. India has always had an entrepreneurial tradition that is itself one of those non-tariff barriers that has kept, in some cases, Western companies from coming into India. This manufacturing advantage, management knowledge creates for India manufacturing opportunities that simply are not available for other developing nations. Among the highest value, most successful manufacturing efforts of our time are those things that do not involve mass production of hundreds and millions of units of the same darn thing, but is manufacturing that requires flexibility, customization, value added at the tail end of the manufacturing process. This is a tremendous opportunity for Indian companies. It is also important, I think, that while India has a tremendous depth of management knowledge, to avoid the delusion that there is some kind of magic, mystical Indian way of management. I've heard it here. I've heard it from academics and others in the Indian diaspora. At the end of the day, there is only one equation, that productivity equation of outputs divided by inputs. There are many locally or industry-specific or culturally specific ways to tweak that equation, but at the end of the day, it's the equation itself that decides who wins and what company wins. At the end of the day, there are management practices that are best practices, and it is important to learn them and not to fool yourself into thinking that there is some third undiscovered practice of management. Yes, there's always innovation, but the fundamental equation is always going to hold true. Now, finally, I'd like to translate this a little bit down to the company level and offer to you a framework by which you, in your companies, might examine manufacturing opportunities, and in particular, might examine the way you can look at the threats and opportunities provoked or created by a global economy. This is actually a model based on some work done by Deanna Farrell at the McKinsey Global Institute that we published about a year ago. It's a model of a way that you can look at your company and at the industry in which your company works and see how much global opportunity you have and how much global threat you face, how likely you are to face the threat from global competition, how likely you are to be able to take advantage of global competition. Farrell suggests that it's important to examine three dimensions. First, production. How feasible is it to disaggregate your industry's value chain? How sensitive is it to relocation? How feasible? How attractive? How much bulk do you have in relation to price and value? It's fascinating to me that the appliance industry is an industry that has, though it is very, very cost competitive, has globalized more slowly than many others, simply because appliances are so inexpensive and shipping is so relatively expensive that appliances is an industry that has resisted, till recently, globalization. So how sensible is it to actually disaggregate production and move it from one place to another? Also in the area of production, what are the location-specific advantages that one country or another might provide? Labor intensity, skill requirements. How standardized are components? Standardized components promote globalization. How specialized are inputs, such as labor or components? That promotes localization. So first, examine the production dimension of your industry. Second, examine the regulatory dimension of your industry. Regulatory factors are among the biggest constraints on globalization. They are going away around the world, but they are going away at different rates in different industries, in different countries. As you assess your industry, its advantage, its potential to go global, its potential to be assaulted by global rivals, examine the regulatory factors, industry by industry, company by company, country by country. And third, look at the organizational factors. Three organizational factors in particular: management, incentives, and labor. What is the extent to which close management supervision is required? Can you run the company from a distance? Is there alignment between the incentives for managers and workers and the economic realities of the business? You can't pay American wages for a commodity business where prices and profit margins are determined by a global market, for example. Finally, the flexibility of labor markets in your industry is a key to determining its global competitiveness. One reason that Indian companies have competed in software is that they can move around the globe. The labor markets here and in California are flexible enough that one can develop world-class skills in one country and easily transfer them to another. I'd like to reiterate that model briefly. Production, regulation, organization. Map your company, map your industry across this, and it will help you predict the rate at which globalization will occur in your industry and the opportunity that it presents to you. Briefly to summarize, I tried to look at three things. First was the question of a services economy, and pointed out that India may be comparatively advantaged in services, and that this however, should not intimidate you from developing a manufacturing sector, but should in fact inform the way the manufacturing hubs develop in India. I tried to suggest a couple of ways in which those factors would come into play, particularly the opportunity to develop Indian branded products at the middle of the market, and especially, and in the long run, the opportunity to develop high-end engineering products for the world market from India. And third, I offered, with this framework from McKinsey, something that I hope will help you in each of your industries analyze the opportunity before you in order to seize it. As I said, it is India's responsibility to take charge of India's development. Let China worry about China. Let the U.S. worry about the U.S. You have plenty of opportunity before you, and I hope you seize it. Thank you.